Hello everyone, and welcome to today's deep dive into one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history, the Japanese bubble economy. You might have heard phrases like lost decade or even lost 30 years. But what really happened? And why does it still affect Japan and the world today? To understand the crash, we first need to understand the boom. The Japanese economy in the 1980s was on fire, fueled by massive exports, high savings, and ultra-loose monetary policy. Japan became the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. But it wasn't just industry and technology, there was something irrational happening under the surface. Real estate prices in Tokyo skyrocketed. This kind of growth didn't happen by accident. In 1985, Japan signed what's known as the Plaza Accord with the US and other major economies. The goal? To weaken the US dollar and strengthen the yen. The result? Japanese exports became more expensive overseas. To keep the economy humming despite a stronger yen, Japan's central bank cut interest rates and flooded the financial system with cheap money. But instead of fueling business investment, the easy money poured into stocks and real estate. Banks lent money like there was no tomorrow. People bought land and shares not because they needed them, but because prices kept going up. It was a classic speculative bubble fueled by greed, confidence, and the belief that, this time, it's different. Between 1985 and 1990, the Nikkei stock index more than tripled. Tokyo land prices doubled, then tripled. Corporations began investing not in innovation, but in property and financial speculation. Even companies like department stores owned skyscrapers in central Tokyo. Then came the crash. In late 1989, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool the market. By early 1990, stock prices began to tumble. The Nikkei crashed from its peak of nearly 39,000 to just over 14,000 in 3 years. Real estate followed. Suddenly, trillions of yen in paper wealth disappeared. Banks were left with mountains of bad loans, money they had lent against assets that were now worth a fraction of their original value. Individuals and businesses were crushed under debt. The government tried to intervene, but it was too little too late. Over the next decade, Japan fell into a deflationary spiral. Prices fell, consumption dropped, and companies stopped hiring. An entire generation grew up without economic growth. This was no ordinary recession. It was a collapse of confidence, a systemic breakdown. Japan went from global superstar to cautionary tale. But the question remains, how did the boom get so big? And why did nobody stop it? After the collapse, Japan entered a period now known as the lost decade, though in reality, it lasted far longer. GDP stagnated, wages stopped growing, asset prices kept falling, and confidence in the future nearly vanished. One of the key challenges was the banking system. Japanese banks held onto massive amounts of non-performing loans that would never be repaid. But instead of writing them off quickly, they delayed. They rolled over debt, propped up zombie companies, and hoped things would improve. This policy of extend and pretend created a chain reaction of dysfunction. Companies that should have gone bankrupt kept surviving, but they stopped innovating, investing, or hiring. Productivity dropped, economic dynamism vanished. And then came deflation. Prices didn't rise, they fell. This might sound good for consumers, but in reality, it was a nightmare. People delayed purchases, expecting things to get cheaper. Businesses lost revenue. Investment dried up. The labor market shifted too. Japan began to rely heavily on non-regular workers, part-timers, contract employees, and temp staff. Job security disappeared. Youth unemployment soared. A whole generation grew up believing that hard work no longer guaranteed success. Politically, the fallout was just as dramatic. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party (LDP), long seen as invincible, lost power in the early 1990s. Corruption scandals like the recruit affair shook public trust. Voter apathy rose. New parties rose and fell. Meanwhile, the government pumped trillions of yen into the economy through stimulus packages and public works. But because demand was weak, the impact was limited. Bridges were built to nowhere. Debt piled up. Infrastructure improved, but the economy didn't. Demographically, the collapse hit hard. Japan's aging population accelerated, birth rates fell. Many young couples postponed marriage and children because of economic insecurity. Japan's population began to shrink. Culturally, a deep sense of unease settled in. Terms like freeder, underemployed youth, and hikikomori, social withdrawal, entered the national vocabulary. Optimism faded, stability remained, but the sense of purpose and upward mobility disappeared. Perhaps the most tragic result was psychological. Japan was still rich, still peaceful, still technologically advanced, but the national mood was one of quiet resignation, a society haunted by what might have been. Despite reforms in the late 1990s and early 2000s, including efforts by Prime Minister Koizumi to deregulate and privatize, Japan never fully recovered its former growth trajectory. The trauma of the bubble lingered. Even today, its shadow remains.